Thank you very much. This talk should have gone before Lausanne, and Lausanne's been very kind to have given most of it for me. So thanks, Lausanne. I'll just skip to the conclusions, and then we can take questions if you... The key question, can the potential of protected areas be unblocked, and why? To reduce and eliminate boundary conflict, catalyze enterprises in neighboring communities or economic enterprises, become politically and economically relevant, and you guys should be shaking your heads by now, be secure in itself and be expanded. Is that possible? We all would like to say yes, but we haven't seen much of it of late. If we look at our protected areas, government's the trustee, funds a lot of our protected areas for current enjoyment, and of course our kids and kids and so on. Being my favorite is the public trust. Our protected areas recently have gone onto a performance management approach where the performance of management is tracked in time. It's to a certain extent integrated into the landscape through the municipal processes and their sector plans. They contribute to our IHE targets, how many species we conserve, and of course they add to our target in terms of how much of our land and sea surface is put aside for conservation. And the conclusion of that is, yeah, all's looking good. But in all that good, there's some challenges. The whole trusteeship of protected areas is not embraced by government, industry, and the public. It's not well understood. And we'll see that through the talks, or we had some this morning, that government is quite happy to accept mining on and inside our protected areas. The values of protected areas are generally not well understood and embraced. You know, we've got a pipeline that has to go down from point A to point B. The farmer says, not on my land. SANRAL says, not in our servitudes. Oh, there's a protected area, we'll put it through that. Funding's decreasing. When we look at our performance assessment across South Africa, we're battling to get 50% pass rate. And land restitution, most of our areas, you know, are in part of the restitution process. That puts conservation agencies like ourselves in an area of uncertainty. You know, who's ultimately our boss? We're just a tenant now. We're no longer serving our masters, but a new set who have got different ideals and expectations. Our neighbouring land use is often incompatible outside of mining, but generally protected areas have been encroached with unsustainable use, and so on. We're below targets. And if we look at KZN and elsewhere, between 2030 and 2050, there's going to be no natural areas outside those protected areas that have been established. So we face a big challenge. If we look over our shoulders back in time, you know, protected areas had a focus on conservation and not about economic transformation. You know, had to get our protected areas to work, increasing pressure, the budget was an issue, limited revenue generating options. You know, we'll put in camps, we'll try this, we'll try that. You know, conservation is trying to be businessmen, not a good equation, with all due respect to my seniors in the not so front row. Buffers, you know, wonderful idea, you know, but they manage through a command and control system, and ultimately the EIA is the mechanism, but that's not effective because transformation's happening. And of course, there's this ongoing boundary conflict and the land restitution challenges that we face. So the question I pose, I've done a few, but this is the most important one. If you were in the middle of Zululand, what would you do with 350 hectares? You know, a little bit of farming happened on it, bit of savanna, nice views. What can you do with 350 hectares when you want to actually make a difference to the neighboring community and of course to yourself in terms of putting some weight in those pockets? Well, That happened to us in terms of the neighboring community came to us and said, we've got this little 350 hectares and we want to put a lodge on it and we want to make lots of big bucks. Where is KZN wildlife in that? And there it is. But when we said, okay, we'll go into contract with you and we will incorporate you into the protected area, namely Kluomfalozi Park, our big flagship. That small little exercise and that little signature at the bottom of a relatively thin document in terms of agreement resulted in 44 million rand being invested in that property. A 44 million rand lodge, and the fences were all put in almost overnight. That lodge then has 30 permanent jobs. 80% of them, 90% of them, come from the very community that put the proposal forward in the first place. And if you go there and you go and ask the staff there, and you say, what do you do? Now I'm the guide. Oh, you work for so-and-so. Oh, no. I work for myself. This is very lucrative. And this was an ex-government employee. And you say, well, how are you doing? He says, well, I've employed 3 of my friends to undertake guiding. So what's happened is that 350 hectares has become an economic driver in that system. But it's only 350 hectares. What does it do? How do we get it right? And the whole point was, if we expand our parks and use our goodwill, we can do a whole lot of things. Just because of Mpambeni, we now got the big 5. People, the 5 Amakosi around the southern part of the park saw that and said, what about us? They got hold of a developer and said, we want the same. Big 5 phase 1 is already in place, the solid red lines. Already in place, proclaimed, EIA's done, all the authorizations going, and upmarket lodges are just about to be built. Fantastic. Well, what else has this done? Well, you've got Umfaleni down on the bottom there that we heard about early on. The information that we got from there is helping us oppose the mine in terms of job creation and wealth generation for the local community, something that the mine is unable to do. Very quickly, you haven't waved at me yet, which is nice. If we look at this inclusive partnership, what happens? Well, from a conservation and protected area impact, now when I say impact, a good impact, saying I'm benefiting from this, we expand the conservation estate. That's my interest. Second thing, we bring in peripheral development. We're not eroding the resource that we need to conserve over time. By putting our own camps in the middle of the park, we can get somebody else to put them on the periphery of the park, and we earn pretty good money out of it. As a result of expanding the park, just from the change in scale, our protected area management costs start dropping. Also, because we're in partnership with that neighbour, our fences seem to stay in place a little longer than they usually do. We also start covering our CBAs. These are these sensitive biodiversity areas outside of our protected areas. So if we can expand into those areas, we're killing, dare I say, 2 birds with 1 stone. The third stone is we're bringing habitat into our under protection, which helps threatened species, be they stuck in the ground or wandering above it. And of course, our ability to manage the protected area increases with no additional cost. And I'm not much of an economist, although I'm getting more and more into the biodiversity economy. This makes sense. From an investment side, Lizanne highlighted really nicely early on. If you want to bring in private investment, you've got to bring in you have to come to the party with security. If you can provide security of tenure, investors are there, because we've got the stunning areas. We saw pictures of that. And if you now be able to combine the area to be invested into the existing branding of the park and use the goodwill, that development in terms of a tourism facility is immediately marketable, and people will recognize that that is a good destination to go to. You don't have to introduce the area and lock people out from other areas or draw them out from other areas. Development costs go down. Well, the most important thing is you don't have to buy the land. That's one of the key failings or stumbling blocks to getting going on an ecotourism venture. You've got to buy the land and then sock it and then fence it and so on. The nice thing is, is that communities or government don't have to foot the bill because you've got a now investment partner. Okay? And at the end of it, as I said earlier on, if you have this three-way partnership, community, government, and private sector, you are the most stable in the investment landscape. Finally, if one looks at from a transformation perspective, and not the traditional transformation that we have to do in politics, but in terms of the landscape, well, by expanding our protected areas, we start reducing infrastructure or tourism infrastructure development costs. You enable communities to have access to game. You provide them with management support. It's not us doing the work, or may not be, but you start recognizing or enabling the community to be an equal partner. And emerging out of it, as I said, there's joint marketing, joint branding. It's cheaper to do it as a collective than individually. Lazan pointed out that communal land's got very little value. As soon as you bring it into this kind of the core of the biodiversity economy, the value of the land goes up, and therefore you can now use that as collateral in terms of getting additional loans. And as I said earlier, in this model, the community is a proactive partner. They're not there just getting handouts. They are part and parcel of the decision-making system. And of all the communities I've worked with, that is one of the most fundamental things. People talk about benefits going to communities and wealth and so on. That's not often what they're looking for. They're wanting to be recognized as a landowner and somebody to be reckoned with in the landscape. And as soon as you've got that in place, you start building the trust that we need. If we look at typical development, I should have brought my pointer. Oh, we've got a point. If we look at a typical development, you have a huge startup cost, and then that tapers off. So if you want to get into ecotourism, you've got to buy the land, stock it with game, build your lodges, and so on, and only then can you start getting going. So if we overlay, there's supposed to be one slide, but anyway, so once you've got over that starting cost and you're getting bums and beds, then you can start generating a profit, and that occurs at a certain time. But if we're able to reduce the startup capital down to zero or very little, and then introduce different types of models to draw community land in, because every place is unique. They all look the same, but they've got different drivers. Once you get that in place, you're able then to bring forward the profit stage. The sooner you start generating profit, the better the business model must be. So essentially, that's what we're doing with incorporating protected areas or communal land into our protected areas. If you look at those different startup scenarios, I didn't dwell very much on it, but there are different ways of doing it. And in each different, as you get more and more complex with your startup models, the most important thing is your costs go down, and the simplest one, and the more, as you go up the scale, costs go down, your management effectiveness goes up, but your budget doesn't change. Then eventually, you get to the next model, budget decreases, get those benefits, and then you get to an income. So effectively, one can then say, we can take community land and the communities to go from a cost circumstance to an income circumstance. 5 minutes, I'm doing well. In a stroke of a pen, and it is literally a stroke of a pen. What are the challenges? Well, we've heard it today. There's resistance to change. If you want anybody to go through a ringer, try to get them try to get them to tell other people how to do their jobs, differently, of course. It's a journey into foreign territory in many respects. There's a lack of understanding of urgency. We've heard that today. We're losing land, biodiversity is under threat. We're even trying to recreate some extinct biodiversity because the urgency is there. But when you come down to forming contracts and talking turkey with neighboring communities, it takes a long time. A contract can take between six months and 3 years. And I've looked at that around the country. Conservation agencies are not really partnership ready. We've got boards and so on. They buy in very quickly. But when it actually gets down to the guy on the ground where the tacky hits the ground, there are many uncertainties and lack of skills and capacity. No slight on them. It's new territory. Bureaucracy is the absolute killer, both in the state, community, and the private sector. They all have their bits and pieces. And social investment costs into community ready, getting the community ready, is a serious hurdle. But often the community is ready, but the state isn't. What is the community? Is it a legal entity? Can we enter into that? So you've got to establish these things beforehand. Startup capital, buy land and erect fencing. Well, we don't have to buy the land, but certainly the fencing is a hurdle. And the most important is early profit flows. If you don't get things going and delivering on the promises, you lose credibility very quickly. And it doesn't matter where you are. If you're in the Northern Cape or in KwaZulu-Natal, it's essentially the same. And then one of the things we really battle with government is adaptive development or management. There's no one model that fits all. But it means in every circumstance is different, and you've got to tackle it that way. Whereas government likes the same thing. One glove fits all hands. Let's just skip this because I know I'm running out. No, I'm not actually. How am I doing for time? Okay, but anyway, if we look at that, what is brought to the party? Well, the community has the land, they have the opportunities. Government, well, they can reduce the costs, they can reduce or remove the challenges for establishing infrastructure and getting the thing going. They facilitate governance and empowerment. They bring in the branding, all of these things. Preferential sourcing of products has just come into law now that we can say, I'm going to use you, neighbouring community, as my preferred contractor, not somebody from Durban. So the systems are there. We just got to take advantage of it. And then the most important thing is we can reduce time to profitability, but just by dropping fences. The private sector, secure an investment, they don't have the supply chain management that government battles with, and they have the business skills. They're the right people to do the business. Don't take a conservationist or a would-be scientist like myself or lawyer and stick him in there and say, make us money. Get the money makers to make the money. Right, the conclusion is, well, I was just going to put duh, but I thought that would be inappropriate. So we have to unblock the biodiversity economy if we're really, really serious about conservation, protected areas, and rural economic upliftment. Thank you.